2 weeks ago, I created a video about big blue bombs and spells. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. But in that video, I covered some spells like Mass Polymorph, Elminster's Simulacrum, and a few other cards that can create a board state from one single spell resolution. This video is actually thanks to Obirad, who is a max tier patron whose video request for this month is to cover other unpopular instant and sorcery spells that leave behind a board state from a single cast. This is kind of with a Cody Vociferous Codex deck in mind, but in general, with that being said, I'm covering cards today that can build a board state, mostly in the form of creature tokens. But yeah, I'm excited for this one. Thank you for the recommendation, Obirad, and for being a patron. I really appreciate you. Before we jump into the cards, I want to give a shout out to the Tricker Tree, who's tuning in from Minnesota. Their favorite commander is Henzi, who is actually one that I want to try out soon. And a favorite pet card of theirs is Swooping Pteranodon, both for the ability, but in particular for the flavor of the card, which I totally agree with. You know, the idea of flying dinosaurs swooping down and stealing your opponent's creatures, then dealing damage to the creatures with a land is pretty great. Yeah, outside of MTG, they are a woodworker / furniture maker and also an illustrator. Honestly, that's so cool. I have the coolest patrons, so thanks Trick or Treat for being a part of the community and for being here. I'm going to go down a list of honorable mentions that were either too popular for this video or just barely didn't make the cut, but either way, I love these cards as well. The first one is March of the Multitudes, which is an instant in Selesnya colors that creates X11 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink, and it has Convoke. So being in Selesnya, this card can make, turn a very big board into a bigger one. But I think that the primary issue is that it's kind of a win more card because you already need a big board state with Convoke to make it bigger, especially with the fact that it has a base CMC of 3 on top of the X. But it is awesome for decks that can consistently get that wide board state. Next up is Stormherd, which honestly is just a classic. How could I not mention it in a video talking about cards that leave behind a huge board state? It's in 35,000 decks. If you have a deck that can get to that 10 mana and cast this, there's not many other spells that I can think of that make a bigger board state from a single cast. March of Progress is another one of these March cards, and it's mostly good for decks playing artifact creatures. So if you are playing an artifact creature deck, the overload cost essentially just doubles your entire board. Sylvan Offering has won me several games in my Azani Center of the Web deck because you can create X plus 1 or X tokens plus 1 because you create the X elves and then you create an XX tree folk token. So that's especially helpful when you're just going to sacrifice them for value. Deploy to the Front is a nice one that creates X11 soldiers where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. So in the late game, that can be a lot of creatures. So if you have a buddy that is going wide, you just went even wider. I swear I am covering a lot of white cards in these honorable mentions, but there won't be as many white cards in the actual cards I cover today. But this one is Release to Memory, which fits the slot of Graveyard Hate while also helping to build up your board. And the last honorable mention is Fresh Meat, which is in only 0.25% of decks that can play it. The fact that this is an instant that counts both tokens and non-tokens is awesome for replacing your board after either a board wipe or a particularly bloodied combat or a sacrifice heavy turn. If you do see a card that you're interested in adding to one of your decks today, it would mean a lot if you use the TCG affiliate link below to help support the channel. Our first card today is Rise of the Dreadmarn, which is in 25,300 decks, or that is just 0.71% of decks that can play it. This is a 3-mana instant that says, create X 2/2 black zombie berserker creature tokens, where X is the number of non-token creatures that died this turn. and it also has a foretell cost of just 1 black. So yeah, this card is pretty great. I'm surprised that I have never seen anyone else play this before, because there's just a few things that I like about this. First of all is that the foretell cost of only 1 black mana is very cheap. That means like you can just keep this. It's super playable to have on hand in the mid to late game, and it's not a very high opportunity cost. You're just holding up 1 mana as opposed to, let's say, if it were 2 or 3, that would feel pretty bad if you ended up holding up the mana but didn't use it and didn't have another mana sink to invest into it. So losing out on just 1 mana if you don't need it isn't terrible at all. The second thing is this is an instant, which is super nice for a foretell ability. Reading this, you would expect it to be an instant. Yeah, that's sure, but you know, it's still versatile in terms of playing this on anyone else's turn. Number 3, this counts everyone's non-token creatures, not just yours. So the most obvious use case is after a board wipe. You know, you cast this for very cheap and build up an instant board state, not just by counting your non-token creatures that died, but everyone else's, which can be a pretty substantial number considering you likely had a very scary board state to deal with in the first place if that merited having a board wipe. Number 4, the tokens it creates are zombies, so that would make sense why the top commanders playing this are zombie decks. So think Wilhelt the Rock Cleaver, the Scarab God, Verena Lich Queen, and Narfi Betrayer King are some of the top commanders playing this. Other ones that are using this are Massacre Girl, who has that built-in board wipe potential to make a huge army at instant speed on your turn. Judith Carnage Connoisseur, who can wipe out all of your opponent's creatures with 1 single death touch spell. Or Ayara First of Locthwain, who is using the massive amount of creatures from 1 spell to drain the board. The last thing that I will mention is this isn't just great as like a board wipe insurance card, but this is a nice piece to use in an Aristocrats deck to get even more sacrifice fodder after sacrificing your creatures. It essentially gives each of your non-token creatures that ability to create a token when it dies. So it's super versatile insurance card for cheap, and like I said, I'm surprised I don't see it more often. Next up is Elemental Eruption, which is in 21,900 decks. This is a 6 mana red sorcery that costs 4 generic and 2 black. It says, create a 1/1 red dragon elemental creature token with flying and prowess. It also has Storm. I got this card in the OTJ precon, and I've really enjoyed seeing which decks I can slot this in, and I've been very happy with it. I use this in my Lila Undefeated Slickshot deck after I've built up an arsenal of free spells to use in 1 explosive turn, where I can hopefully give them haste as well. This card has a high CMC, which makes it feel like, you know, you wouldn't be able to get much from the Storm effect after dropping 6 mana, but there are just, you know, there's so many ways to reduce the cost of spells, like Magnus the Red or Mizzix of the Ismagnus, or you can cast things for free with cards like Narset Enlightened Exile, or even Magar of the Magic Strings, who kind of breaks that color pie and uses this in Rakdos. Another type of deck that I could totally see running this in are decks that can cast sorcery spells at flash speed. So someone like Najal the Stormrunner, if you don't have the cost reduction or the free spell enablement in place, you could just opt to cast this on another person's turn to capitalize on a ton of spells or interaction going on their turn instead of yours. The last thing I'll say, the prowess tacked on to the 4/4 dragons makes them super scary, especially because the decks that are choosing to play this can get a lot of prowess triggers in a single turn. I'm curious, for anyone who did buy the Outlaws of Thunder Junction precons, which one, or I guess what is a favorite card that was released in one of those decks? Our next card, this one has actually won me several games before as well. It's Sazat's Will, which is in 21,000 decks. This card is a 5 mana instant. It costs 4 generic and 1 black. And it says, choose one. If you control a commander, as you cast this spell, you may choose both. Each opponent sacrifices a creature they control with the greatest power. And the second option is exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards, then create X 0/1 black Thrall creature tokens, where X is the greatest power among creatures exiled this way. Like, wow, where do I even start with this? You know, people do talk a lot about 3-for-1 spells, but this one is like a 7-for-1 spell if you have your commander in play. And here's what I mean. So the first 3-for-1 is that 3 opponents sacrifice their strongest creatures from one single spell. That already as a baseline is very good. And that mode alone is powerful enough that other different card versions or variations of this ability already see a lot of play in Commander. The second 3-for-1 is that you exile all of your opponent's graveyards while also maintaining your own graveyard. So it's asymmetrical graveyard hate. I think graveyard hate in general is just super underrated and can sometimes, feel bad to include in your deck if there's no other effect tied on, because you don't know when you'll actually need it or if you're actually going to go up against a graveyard deck tonight. So having this as an option on an already useful removal spell is just excellent. And the last thing that makes this a 7-for-1 is that you create a ton of tokens equal to the greatest power among creatures that were exiled, including the most powerful creatures that your opponents controlled that were just barely sacrificed to this card. So even in a game without, let's say, any big green stompy creature players, I think it's fair to say that a 6/6 creature is likely to be on the board at any time in the game where you have enough mana to cast this, in addition to all the other stuff that you just did. You could create, very likely 5 or 6 creature tokens on top of what you just did to be sacrifice fodder or blockers. The icing on the cake for this card is that all of this can happen at instant speed, which puts the value for this just over the top in my opinion, and is why I've won so many games with this card. They never see it coming, and the thralls I create is usually enough to fuel some aristocrat shenanigans for the win. And for anyone who is not aware, this is part of the Commander Legends will cycle, including 2 cards that were popular enough to have a reprint with Akroma's Will in white and Jessica's Will in red. Then there's the lesser known options which were just too unpopular to be included as a reprint in a precon because it's just not an incentive to make someone want to buy the deck. So those ones are Kamal's Will, which is in green, Sakashima's Will, which is for blue, and Sazat's Will, which is here in black. I've used them all except for Kamal's Will, so let me know if I am missing out there. We're covering a few cards for this next slot, and that's because they all have like a variation of an ability, but in different colors. So the first one is Spawning Spider, or Spider Spawning, which is in 15,800 decks. This one creates a 1/2 green spider creature token with reach for each creature card in your graveyard, and it has a flashback. The next one is Rise from the Tides, which is in 15,100 decks. This one is in blue and creates a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. The next one is Revenge of the Rats in 11,300 decks. This one creates a tapped 1/1 black rat creature token for each card in your graveyard and also has a flashback. And Worm Harvest creates a 1/1 black and green worm creature token for each land card in your graveyard and has retrace. So yeah, a lot of different variants, but they can be helpful in a lot of different decks. So if you're playing a graveyard deck, Spider Spawning, Revenge of the Rats, and Worm Harvest can create, high single or double digit tokens even. If you've ever seen a player recur like 10 plus lands with Lumra Bellow of the Woods, Worm Harvest can create that many creature tokens instead, and it can happen again later on a different turn with Retrace. Alright, it's time for another Collector Booster giveaway real quick, and this month it is for Baldur's Gate Collector Booster giveaway. I actually opened one recently and caught a borderless Ancient Silver Dragon and a foil borderless Ancient Brass Dragon in the same pack. So hoping that the winner of this has that same level of luck. All right, let's see. Nice. Congrats, David, on the collector booster win. I'll reach out to ask where you want me to ship this to. Our next card today is Fairy Slumber Party, which is in 13,500 decks. This is a 6 mana blue sorcery that costs 4 generic and 2 blue. It says, return all creatures to their owner's hands. For each opponent who controlled a creature returned this way, you create 2 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying, and this creature can block only creatures with flying. This one is a little bit different than the other options I'm including today in terms of cards, that leave behind a board state, because the primary purpose of this is not the token generation itself, it's the byproduct of a more important reason to include this in your deck, which is a board wipe option. So obviously, if you're playing mono blue, this is a typical bounce board wipe where you don't have access to exiling or destruction board wipe effects. So you're casting this, obviously because you need the board wiped, but it is a huge benefit that you're able to create creatures as a leave behind from that board wipe. I'd imagine in most games, you'll be getting 6 creatures for something that you're already wanting to do in the first place, which is just great. And I like this as an option in Dimir color decks, because if you're not playing game changers like Cyclonic Rift, and outside of mono black board wipes like Toxic Deluge, I don't like as much damnation type effects that have just the destroy, because there are so many cards these days that give indestructibility, like a heroic intervention or something like that. However, outside of exiling, bouncing creatures is just an excellent way because everyone gets hit with it, even if they have indestructibility. And Dimir can actually make use of those 6 creature tokens that you just left behind as resources in the form of sacrifice fodder or some of the altars, things like that. Yes, the creature tokens only can block creatures with flying, which is kind of a bummer, but it's not as bad as some of the mites or other creatures that can't block at all. And so they have evasion and they can block other evasive creatures, which is nice. Our next card today is Plague of Vermin, which is in 13,400 decks. This is a 7 mana sorcery that costs 6 generic and 1 black, and says, starting with you, each player may pay any amount of life. Repeat this process until no one pays life. Each player puts a 1/1 black rat creature token into play for each 1 life he or she paid this way. Okay, yeah, this card is expensive money-wise, like real money-wise, but also CMC-wise. I do think that in any black deck, this can 100% just one-shot the entire board if you're able to resolve this, because, well, that's assuming that you have some aristocrat effects in place. This, in an IR deck, can refund the life you paid, because for each 1 life that you just paid to create a creature, you get that back, in addition to draining the table as well. Sephiroth Fabled Soldier is another clear option that could benefit from this with, that built-in aristocrat line, and even better if you're in the late game and already have an emblem. So Sephiroth, yeah, doesn't drain the entire board, but even just the target opponent is still pretty wild. And yeah, so if you have 40 life, let's say, even though it's late game, I would be weary of doing maybe 37 life in case someone has some sort of direct damage effect. But let's say you were conservative and did 25 or 30. Then you just created 30 creature tokens. If you have 1 effect like Bastion of Remembrance and an infinite sacrifice outlet, that's 30 damage to the board. And if you have a second one in place, like a Zulaport Cutthroat, that's now 60 damage. If this wasn't so expensive, it would already be in my Azani Center of the Web deck. And I still might bite the bullet and pay to buy this card, because sacrificing 4 tokens at any time that I want is just so good, especially when I have something on the board like an Aristocrat effect or Dina Soul Steeper. This card is just crazy potential for the number of creatures you can create. Our next card is Subjugate the Hobbits, which is in 10,700 decks. This card is a 7 mana sorcery again. It has costs 5 generic and 2 blue. It says gain control of each non-commander creature with mana value 3 or less. Nice. Yeah, I have this card in a few big mana decks, and I'm always happy to see this, and I've always benefited a ton from casting this card. Not only does this take very helpful creatures like a Tireless Provisioner or a Mother of Runes, things like that, it also takes all of the creature tokens on the board. Well, that's assuming that the token isn't copying a creature, because tokens that aren't copying the creature just have mana value 0. So this card can take a lot more cards than people suspect. Most of the commanders playing this are Lord of the Rings commanders like Sauron the Dark Lord or Saruman the White Hand or Sauron Lord of the Rings, likely due to the flavor pairing, but this also works in Emoti Celebrant a Bounty, which is one that I played in, or something like Gore, Muldrak, Amniphologist, and Phenologist to steal the tokens you're giving to other players. One other note I will say about this card is I like it because it's less salty because you are stealing non-commander creatures. So if you were also able to steal people's commanders, this would be even more salty. And so I do like the fact that I can cast this without feeling too bad about, stealing one of my opponent's commanders. This next card is one that I really like. It's called Curious Herd and is in 9,570 decks. This is a 4 mana green instant that costs 3 generic and 1 green. It says choose target opponent. You create X 3/3 green beast creature tokens where X is the number of artifacts that player controls. This card is awesome, and it just keeps getting better over time because more and more artifact tokens are getting released, and it's just a staple nowadays in Commander. This could be used to play against clue decks, treasure decks, or even something like a Ygra Eater of All, which turns all of your opponent's creatures into artifacts as well. Or even new mechanics that are just getting released with time, like Lander tokens. I will say be cautious if you do use this against someone with a ton of treasures, because they could just sacrifice the treasures, and then if that's the majority of their artifacts, then you won't create as many as you intended. But that could be a good way to make someone get rid of all of their mana. Also, just mana artifact ramp is one of the most common forms of ramp in the game. And so even if someone isn't playing a dedicated artifact token deck, you can still likely create quite a bit of creature tokens from this spell. I love the fact that this is an instant because it's kind of a pretty uncommon effect for green to have to do something like this at instant speed. Yeah, it's known for fogs, but creating an army out of nowhere, and a substantial one at that, is just awesome because these aren't just 1/1s. These are 3/3s, and that can be a very viable blocking threat. I also love that these do not enter tapped, so you don't have to wait until an end step to cast this. And the last thing is these are beast tokens, so it does synergize with beast decks if you are playing something like that, like a Slinza the Spike Stampede. We have 2 more. This next one is Descent of the Dragons, which is in 6,630 decks. This is a 6 mana sorcery that costs 4 generic and 2 red, and it says destroy any number of target creatures. For each creature destroyed this way, its controller puts a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying onto the battlefield. First of all, this art is just sick. I love the way, they're depicting the size of those dragons just swooping in down to destroy this herd. I do like this card a lot for a few reasons. The first of which is that this card is great to act as a removal spell. You can target any number of creatures, whereas these type of effects usually are X spells where it's like, you remove as many creatures as you invested into X. But I think maybe a 4/4 flying dragon is a nice enough gift that you're giving someone that Wizards of the Coast didn't limit this to just X spell or X cost when they created this, because they're like, yeah, you're giving them a pretty decent body left behind. Not only does this act as a removal spell, this is an upgrade to your tokens as well. So if you're playing a Goblin deck, or let's say a Boros deck with a ton of 1/1 white soldier tokens, This not only acts as removing your opponent's creatures or all of their commanders, you're also upgrading your 1/1 soldiers into a massive board of 4/4 flying dragons. And I love the fact that this can be used as an upgrade, because if you do happen to kill your opponent's commanders while you're at it, you're going to have even more dragons than theirs, so that you can block them if they decide to try and swing at you. Our last card today is Devout Invocation, which is in 4,980 decks. This is a 7-mana sorcery that costs 6 generic and 1 white. It says tap any number of untapped creatures you control. Put a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying onto the battlefield for each creature tapped this way. Okay, yeah, I will say that this card is not as good as a lot of the others I've covered today, but it is very good in the decks that can fit it in. Yes, it does have a high CMC cost with the 7, which so do a lot of these, which is why, they're big cards that can leave behind a board state. Not only does it have the high CMC, it also has a second associated cost, which is you need to tap the creatures. So you do have to have some creatures on the board in order for this to be a payoff. But in terms of commanders playing this, the ones that are playing this a lot is Elminster, who is the top commander, because it can make this very cheap to cast, and Elminster can also create a ton of mini tokens that can be used to tap them and create even more 4/4 white angel tokens. Giada is a great one for this because it puts a +1/+1 counter on each angel that's entering, and Tristani Selesnia's Voice can gain like 50 or 100 life from this spell alone. So yes, I will say that in my honorable mentions, I mentioned that the first one, which was March of the Multitudes, is kind of a win more spell. This one is similar. It doesn't say Convoke, but you have to tap the creatures, so you have to have something on the board. But like I said, if you do have a deck that is already going wide and you have the ability to turn 1/1s into 4/4 flying angels, then this is a great one for you to consider. That's everything that I had today. Thanks again, OBRad, for the video idea. If you are interested in guaranteeing a video topic of your choosing every single month, then check out the Patreon, where the top tier, you get to choose a video for me to create every single month. I'd love to hear what you think of the cards that I shared today, and if there's any I missed that you love. And yeah, hope to see you next time. Thanks for being here.